Have you ever been in a situation when you were asked to take on a responsibility that you were not sure at all you could do, but there was no way to say no? Well, that's what happened to me in March just of this year. I was in Kenya on the Masai Mara. I was on safari, and someone heard about my work and came to me and said there was a little baby, a little Maasai baby, who had a cleft. And I said, I'll go to the village. They were going to bring the baby to my safari lodge, but I'd learned. I said, I'll go to the village. So my driver was my guide. He took me around to the different game reserves. And he okayed it. It was only 15 minutes away. So we drive to the Maasai village. So in the Maasai village, the center of the Maasai village is a big circular corral. But this corral has about 10-foot-high planks that are thick, and they're right next to each other. And the reason is there's many lions on the Masai Mara, and in March especially, it's a time when the lions are very hungry because all the wildebeests are in the Serengeti. So I arrive at the village, and then I see the house where I'm going. And a Maasai house, they're all the same too. They're about 14 feet square. You go in the front door, you walk 2 steps, and then you take another step or 2. And then there's a bench, sort of like this, except it's only about 12 inches off the ground. About 24 inches in front of you is an open fire where wood burns, and that's the kitchen. To the left is a bed, and to the right is the other bed. And there on that bed was the mother with a big smile on her face. And in her arms was a blanket. And when I moved the blanket aside, I could see that there was a baby there, and the baby had a cleft lip and cleft palate. So cleft palate, well, we'll go on. The mom said that she had not been able to express enough breast milk. And they took the baby to the Maasai clinic on the Masai Mara, and the Maasai clinic had given her a tin of baby formula. Well, the baby formula is a very short-term solution because it's $14 a can, and the Maasai don't have running water. And so they would have to take water from the barrel of rain collected and boil it, and then put it with the formula and give it to the baby. The family couldn't afford to buy another tin of baby formula, so by the end of that week, the mom was producing even less milk because the baby hadn't fed from the mom. So I asked the mom to come out and talk to me and let me see her. I've worked with a lot of babies born with cleft palate. In the reason we had to go out in the house, the only window was this little window of ventilation, maybe 8 inches a circle right above the stove. So the mom came out with me, and I started to see the baby. Now, the Maasai people, I don't know if you know the Maasai, they're tall and thin, and most of the men, over 50%, are over 6 feet high. They're very thin. They're the ones that lean on have their leg up, lean on their spear, and they have that red plaid blanket that they wear, and they're cattle herders, slim people. So I looked at the baby, and I lifted up the blanket just to see, and I saw the rib cage. And then I also saw a distended stomach. Now, I've learned that I don't expect African babies to look like our little American babies. Some do, and some don't. But the Maasai, I would think, would definitely not. But then I looked longer and deeper into that baby, and I saw that one thing I know about African hair is when a baby is malnourished, there's a red tint to that African hair in the light, and that baby had that. The other thing I saw was the fontanelle, which is that space the skull doesn't fully fuse in utero, so then the baby can pass more easily through the birth canal. You know, you're not supposed to touch the top of the baby's head. But with this baby, the fontanelle, I'd never seen this. It was actually, the skin was depressed because the baby was dehydrated. And because babies are fed only through liquid, it also meant that he was malnourished. Additionally, that baby was listless, and had this weak cry, and had this look of struggle on his face. The baby wasn't a newborn baby. He was 3 months old. But the mom had this beautiful smile on her face. So I knew that I had to get help for this baby. I'd worked with a lot of little babies like this, and you can lose these babies very quickly because they're fragile and they're small and there's not a lot of resilience. I had just I was in Kenya because I'd done some work with Smile Train in Nairobi at a conference, and so I called Smile Train East Africa, the director who I just spent a lot of time with. And he said, well, we actually do have a place in Kenya that specializes in nutrition for babies born with cleft palate. I said, let me talk to the person, let me see. It was 7 hours away from where we were. But my driver, who was Christian, from a different tribe, but Christian, and this was Easter Sunday, he saw the baby and he saw the path we had to take, and he said, I will go, I'll drive you. So we drove. The next morning, I have to say that night I didn't sleep very much because I felt this enormous responsibility, and I truly wasn't sure whether I had the skills. I'm just a speech therapist. And even doctors would have other people and ways of understanding what this child needed and providing it for them. So I didn't sleep much. The next morning, we got to the village at about 6:45. And the mom was there, the dad was coming with us. There were about 9 kids. The family had 5 kids, but there were more and more kids every time I was there. And we started to drive, and we had sort of a van-y kind of thing. And I noticed there were all these Maasai along the dirt road. And I said to the cousin who had brought me there, I said, wow, everybody's out in the morning. And the cousin said to me, everyone knows about this baby. And they all know you're there to help him. And they all wanted to see you be helping him. So they were smiling, and I was more and more fearful that I didn't have the skills. But there was no one else to turn to. We drove for 7 hours, and I kept checking the baby to make sure the baby was still alive, because for those of you who've been in Africa, you know that many of the roads in Africa are not great. Even the paved roads are not great, and most of the time we were not on paved roads. And you call it the African massage because you're bumping all over the place, which is fine when you're this age. You end up with a couple of bumps and maybe a pulled muscle and a little soreness. But when you have a baby who's 3 months old, who's so fragile, I kept worrying about that baby. We finally did get to the hospital, and they admitted him. Took a couple of hours, and they needed to check his weight. And it was quiet in the hospital, except the emergency room was active. And I walked in with the mom, the driver, and the father waited outside. And I walked in with the mom, and for the first time, she took off the blankets and all the inner clothing that would be on this baby and put him on the scale without any clothes. And I saw a pause in the emergency room of all the activity because people could see, the doctors and the nurses could see this baby was in such extreme shape. The baby was accepted to the hospital, admitted, thank God. We learned the weight. So this was a 3-month-old baby, and he weighed 6 pounds, 2 ounces. He was admitted to the hospital. I truly didn't know if he was going to survive. That evening, I went back to Nairobi, and I was in the hospital. My mom, who's 95, I called my mom on my FaceTimed her. There was all kinds of internet in Nairobi. And I talked to my mom, and I said, Mom, and I just started sobbing, because it was a relief for me, but it was also this fear. How had I done with this responsibility? And was it right what I had done? Had I done everything? I flew back the next day to Paris, and a few weeks later, I got an email from the director of the hospital and the person in Smile Train East Africa saying that the baby had been in the hospital for 3 weeks and had been discharged. When I had been there, I always think about the long term. So I wasn't going to give them money for a can or 2 of food. I had given the family enough money so that they had a can of formula, enough money for cans of formula and milk and water until the baby was 7 months old. So I knew everything was covered by Smile Train at the hospital. Once the baby got out, at least I knew we'd have nutrition until he was old enough to eat solid foods, more solid foods. When I looked at the pictures of this little baby, and his name was Isaac, I saw that he now was thin, but Messiah thin, and I knew that he was going to live. Thank you.